Neuralink is developing the ability to put up to 10,000 sensors into our brain. Sensors that are smaller than a human hair, sensors that are resilient, sensors that feed data patterns back to a transmitter that can link with computers, with interfaces to other human beings, with stimulators, meaning the communication goes both ways. These are both receivers and transmitters of electrical patterns. And in doing so is opening up the frontier of consciousness about what's going on inside our mind, and also opening the frontier to both recognizing and synthesizing patterns that lead to disease, that lead to deteriorating well-being, and patterns of disruption that can stimulate well-being, that can rehabilitate and lead to ease, lead to well-being. The software, the paradigm, the technology that allows us to get an increasingly bright picture about the human mind, about its interface with human consciousness, is being developed and is showing tremendous promise. Now let's look at this in the paradigm of fractal patterns. In fractal patterns, one of the things that, if you've kind of ever played with your phone and kind of zooming in or watched any of the fractal graphic generators, you see this very interesting thing where the same pattern essentially repeats over and over again in endless, in kind of an endless zoom. You zoom in, and that tiny little dot becomes a spiral, becomes such a spiral that can't fit on the screen. But by that time, you've seen a tiny spiral within the spiral that zooms out and zooms out. And this is mesmerizing and somewhat psychedelic, visual experience. But these mathematical formulas of fractal patterns, which were not developed by human beings, they're discovered by human beings, meaning they are innate within the mathematical framework of our reality and of our universe, speak of something that we all feel and experience intuitively, that the individual in some way reflects their family, that the family in some way reflects their community, that the community in some way reflects their country, that a moment in time has a lot to do with the larger moment in the species time, that which goes on in one country has a lot to do with what's going on with other human beings in the rest of the world, that what's going on in a moment has a tremendous amount to do with what's going on in the environment, that one could call the personal experience and the personal moment as, in a way, a stepped down version of what's going on in the environment around. It's very unusual to find complete dissociation between an individual and what's going on around in that environment, meaning when the room is hot, you get hot. When the room is argumentative and sociopathic, you become more sociopathic and argumentative, at least emotionally, if not physically. In other words, what goes on in the cell, in the individual, relates to what's going on in the group, in the larger body. Everything is connected. And within this paradigm of fractal patterns, one of the things that it suggests is that if a pattern works really well on an individual level, it can lead to greater success on a larger level. And so there's an intuitive connection between what's going on in one human brain and what's going on the planet. You could call the planet a brain. Regions and whole countries have certain things going on over here. Meanwhile, other qualities of the species are more exaggerated over here. One of the interesting things in the brain is that, for example, there's at least one case where 98% of the brain is dead. It's drowned in water. And the person is almost completely normally functional from 2% of the brain in a way that defies all of the generally accepted theory, that the laugh, the laugh cells of the brain are right here. You touch here and people find things funny, and you touch here and people get scared, and you touch here and there's regression type memories, and here's Broca's region of the brain where language is shut down. And while the brain does seem to organize in that way, in a healthy brain, you find that somehow it manages to get all those jobs and facilities done when half the brain is dead, we don't have a full theory to fully understand this. And so if, for example, all of the vacation area of a given town was wiped out by a tsunami, the vacationing area would tend to move because people still have the need for a vacation. It's, they just can't hold the vacation in the designated white sand beach, so they just hold the vacation in a less attractive beach because that beach is unavailable. And it seems somehow as if the brain is capable, it has its preferences of, if we're going to laugh, I'd prefer to laugh in this area of the brain, but somehow if that area of the brain is taken offline, well, laughter's important, we'll just reallocate resources and laugh from some other area in the brain. If we look at the brain and what Neuralink is doing by inserting hairline probes into varying depths all around the brain, avoiding blood vessels, etc. One of the things that they're learning is that they don't need to have a probe for every single synapse and connection point in the brain. That, for example, just like a reporter, you don't need one reporter for every single person in the room in order to know what's going on in the room. A single reporter surrounded by 100 people having a debate can get a good reading of what's going on in the debate, what's going on in the room, and a single hairline probe can get feedback about patterns of electrical energy, etc., from a variety of surrounding brain activity. And it's a little bit like a pixel metaphor where, we used to be very excited with 280p, 280 pixels per square inch, I think it is. And that gave you blurry videos, but you could tell what's going on. And in many ways, that's the key breakthrough. At 1 pixel per square inch, you can't tell what's going on. At 4K, at 4,000 pixels per square inch, you're there. It's not just what's going on. You're there. You're living it. It's completely supplanted the reality. But even at 140p, you can tell what's going on in the room. And that's the breakthrough. Going from no visual data to understanding who's who. Oh, that's that person. They're 10 feet away from here. That's that person that they're 20 feet away from there. So-and-so is clearly over 50 years old. So-and-so is a child. You can do that with 140 pixels a square inch. Much easier with 280. By the time, we're getting to 400 and 700 and stuff, the breakthrough isn't as significant. It's no longer delivering more, useful data in terms of, who said what first. You've got that at 140p with the audio background, etc. And so the rest is just luxury in many ways. It's more fun. Going from 180p to 4K is fun. It's more realistic. There's less, need to attend to it and more ability to just imagine you are there. And the same phenomena is true with these probes in the brain. If you put 1 million probes in the brain, you have a 4K image. It's totally realistic. But with even 200 probes, with even 1,000, you've got a clear enough image of different electrical patterns going on in the brain to know what's going on in what sequence and why on that dimension, on the electrical dimension. And that's a significant breakthrough. Well, looking at the planet as a fractal step-up, in other words, if rather than being so egocentric, we zoomed in on the full pattern of the planet, and then zoomed in and zoomed in and zoomed in until the planet got so big we couldn't focus on it. But as that started to occur, a single human brain started to come into focus with many of the same, spiral-like shapes, an echo, so to speak, a holographic echo of what was going on in the larger planet. One of the things that we can see, with much more detail is as we travel the whole planet and get lots of, sensory data, etc., from the planet, because we are so small, we're able to get zoomed in details that we can't, meaning it's very difficult with 60,000 thoughts a day or something of that nature to know more than 4 or 5 thoughts. There's just so many little nuances in an individual human being. But as you travel the globe for a year, you hear drifts of this value system and drifts of this prioritization system and drifts of these, mental or religious memes over here and over here. You get a sense of swimming in the pattern versus kind of looking from above and just getting a few little subtle hints. And one of the things that we know about perception, we have 2 ears and 2 eyes. Why? Well, we get a sense of depth perception that if we only have 1 eye and 1 ear, we don't have. It's harder to extract the dimensionality out of an object when there's 1 eye and 1 ear and 1 nostril than when there's stereo. I mean, that's the whole basis of GPS. You have a satellite here and you have a satellite here. If you just have the one satellite passing over and it's getting a little bit louder, a little bit fainter, it's a very weak, you have a very weak ability to pinpoint the individual on the ground. If you can connect with 5 satellites, though, simultaneously that are talking to each other, you can often get within a square meter because you're looking from multiple perspectives. And in a perspective on a given dimension, for example, on the horizontal plane, looking from this angle, the image is slightly different than looking from this angle. And the further away we develop, we place the eyes, meaning if you had an eye here and an eye here rather than just 6 inches away, the depth perception would be significantly sharper. You would be significantly more capable of measuring through intuitive correlation if your eyes were this far apart. And one of the biggest gaps, we have the progression from the individual, which correlates with the family, which correlates with the culture, which correlates with the country and weather and stuff, and then that correlates with the species. You have this enormous jump between the individual and the species, between the human body and the planetary body. It's a vast leap. It's like having eyes that are thousands of meters apart, looking at the same object and comparing notes. And of course, if you had a sphere, and you were looking from 2 points, a million miles apart, you might be able to see most of the whole sphere, because the eye over here sees this half of the sphere. You think of the human head, or whether it's the moon or the human head. If you have data observing devices at 180 degrees, you see what's going on this side of the head from this side, and you see what's going on from this side of the head from here. And of course, if you have 4, it's even better, but still, you can get a vastly more sophisticated image. And in doing so, one of the things that happens is we reconcile paradoxes of duality. If you imagine, for example, a lens in front of in front of the moon and a lens behind the moon, and you might say, well, that area of the moon is dark, and the other eye says, no, it's not, because it's not dark from that perspective. Or if you have a sensor on the South Pole and another sense in the equator, and you say the world is very hot, and you say, no, the world is very cold. Well, of course, they're both true, but until you have this paradigm of looking from multiple perspectives simultaneously, you can't say that, yeah, within the overall object of the Earth, parts of it are very cold, parts of it are very warm, parts of it are very peaceful, parts of it are very violent, parts of it are sleeping, parts of it are waking. So the real thing, to get a full image of what's going on, you need multiple sensors in multiple places. And as you have that, more and more things become true. The world is a loving place. No, it is not. They're both true. It depends on where the sensor is. If you're happily in love in a tropical oasis and everyone's smiling at you and being kind, it's a pretty accurate reading to say the world is a loving place. If you're in Somalia and you're 10 years old and your 8-year-old sister was just raped and you've been given a machine gun to kill other people or be killed, the world is a very cruel place. They're both true. Now, people have arguments all the time because they're referencing different data. The world is great, the world is terrible, God exists, no he doesn't, God's a she, no he isn't, all this stuff. Paradox and polarity resolve with the depth perception that comes from simultaneous synthesis of multiple observing and measuring devices on multiple dimensions, because dimension, of course, adds to another thing. If you're on a one-dimensional plane and you say the world's pretty boring, you say no, it's not, because you're looking at a whole pattern of energy in a 3-dimensional or 10-dimensional plane, but the eye on the one dimension can't see it. So you have arguments based on different focuses on different dimensions at different times in different patterns. If I'm looking at the Mona Lisa, and I don't know that I'm looking at the Mona Lisa because I don't have the full vision, I could go to this dark point in her eye and then go to this dark point in her clothing and this crease here, and I could say this is a very, very dark and ugly image. There's nothing but darkness here because I've pointed my lens here, 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 where there's darkness. And I could do the opposite. I could say, no, there's a lot of light, and go here, 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 and say it's light. or we can step back and see the Mona Lisa in the chaotic interference pattern of dark and light colors that each add vividness to one another. And and this is very much the state that we're in at the moment, is tuning in to different dimensions from different angles with different paradigms at different times, at different contexts and places in reality. And we are doing our normal egotistical, expansionism to project the world out of the macrocosm of what we are experiencing and what we have experienced. As we move out of that myopia into a bigger vision, we experience a transcendence of egotistical consciousness. That's one of the most phenomenal experiences a human being can have. Now, the fractal pattern that what Neuralink is doing can and will work at revealing patterns of data on the dimensions, certainly the electrical dimension in which it is functioning, which of course in integrated system theory, all dimensions intersect in some level, and so if you can track even only the electrical dimension, there will be correlations between what's going on the electrical dimension and what's going on, in protein or various other dimensions that cannot directly be measured by the probe, but that affect parts of the brain that can be measured by the probe, which is one of the reasons why in holographic theory, if you take a hologram and you cut it into 10 pieces, and then you take 1/10 piece, good instrumentation can reveal what the entire hologram was by looking at a small piece. By looking at a small square, a small piece, good instrumentation can reveal what was happening on the rest of the hologram, because within each piece of the hologram is a microcosm of the larger. In other words, holograms are fractal in nature as well. If we accept the fractal nature of reality, one of the most logical conclusions is that once we discover, for example, do we need one probe per 1,000 kind of people around, the little entities that are moving in the brain? To do good reporting, like how many reporters do you need in a room to cover 100 people, 1,000 people? Or do you need per room to get a pretty good sense of what happened and what went on in that room in kind of the significant highlights? And that same question is being researched and discovered by Neuralink. How many reporters, how many probes do you need in this region of the brain to get a general sense of what's going on? Is it 1 per 1,000? 1 probe per 1,000 observable interactions that we're trying to track? Is it 1 per 10 interactions? What's important? And it's very likely that this science can be applied on a global species level, where if you can say that you can get a very good sense of what's going on in the room if you have one reporter per 100 people, that we can get a very good sense of what's going on in the species at real time. If 1 per 100 people agrees to be a probe in what way? Well, within the fractal nature of reality, of course, if there's war and fighting around the one person who's a probe, their body is going to register different chemicals, statistically speaking, than if there's peace and love. So knowing what's going on in the body of 1 person per 100 across the planet may allow us to watch waves of fear migrate, peak, and descend as news memes travel around the world, or as political regimes change, or as natural disasters hit. And to be able to graph and watch the migration of the emotion of fear through the species, and to understand what that correlates to. Do heart attacks go up or down in response to a wave of fear? Does violence go up or down in response to a wave of fear? Does it matter what the fear is? If one is afraid of one's government attacking you, does fear goes down, or does violence go down? But if you're afraid of a criminal attacking you, fear goes up, or violence goes up. What are the correlation? We are learning. We are in the infantile state of consciousness, in part because some scientific theory does not even acknowledge that consciousness exists. In the materialistic absurdities of reductionist science, you will have a scientist give you a lecture basically telling you that the lecture is not happening, that everything he's saying is an illusion and doesn't even exist, and if it does, it's meaningless. So why is he giving the lecture? It's a good question. If consciousness is a delusion and life is purposeless and meaninglessness, then why on earth should you buy someone's book that says it's really important that your consciousness grasps my idea that you don't mean anything? Because the obvious implication is the scientist doesn't mean anything either. So why on earth waste money on his book? Why did he bother writing it? At some level, there's a deep conflict in reality, and that no scientist who truly believes he is a delusion that has absolutely no purpose, why on earth would he sit down and stop enjoying the sunlight and write some book that hardly anyone's going to buy? So you have the possibility of expanding this paradigm of neural link and synergizing it by employing the same amounts of the same number of probes, only they can be much more nuanced at a planetary level than they can be in an individual brain. Within an individual brain, it's very hard to get the things to be small enough so as not to cause damage and interference to the brain. And so their abilities to track, you can't track smell on such a small probe, you can't put little cameras on you can just track a little bit of electrical pulses. And so there's very crude data. But were you to look at the entire planet and species as one brain, and then say rather than 200, 1,000, 10,000 probes, we're going to, for 7 billion people, we will have 1 billion people be our probes. So 1 in 7 will be probes. And as we become increasingly connected with our devices, in part by Neuralink, but also in part by Bluetooth and other sensors, by online, by tracking, by GPS, as we generate extraordinary amounts of data, meaning at any given point, our temperature is a certain range. At any given point, our emotions, which correlate to our own biology, are in a certain configuration. At any given moment, we're smiling or not smiling, or half smiling. Our volume of our voice is going up and down, correlating with various other patterns, including energy patterns. Our sleep activity is doing this and this. Our dream activity is doing this and this. Our money is going up and our money is going down. And more of these data and vectors, more of this data is vectoring online, because in the last little while, the data about our banking has gone from cash, in a teller and a ledger over the last 100 years, to being on a computer that's offline, to being on a computer that's online on our phone. So now our phone knows the flow of our cash flow, knows how much money we have in the bank, knows how much our phone knows how much the country is saving for retirement. Our phone knows whether there's a cash crunch and how widespread it is. Or I should say phones do. If you could talk to all the phones in the United States, you would know on a bell curve how people were doing on cash flow, how people were doing on debt in real time, how they were doing on retirement, how their investments were doing, how nervously and rapidly they made decisions, how reactive. Meaning, for example, if a news story goes out and half the country sells its shares in a given company, it's a very reactive or volatile market, because you have a negative news story and then half the country sells its share, which is going to destroy the value of that company. So it becomes a very volatile situation. So our phone knows that. As sensors are integrating with Fitbits, etc., we know the pulses of the nation. Our phones know the pulse rate of the nation. And there may be correlations between the pulse rate of 18 to 24-year-olds and how sexually gratified they are. But we can probably know that as well based on timing, based on proximity to other people. Our phones are learning more and more information as we move into the Internet of Things. Our phones know what we ate and what we didn't, how much is in our refrigerator, which can let emergency preparedness people know as power outages or hurricanes hit, can gauge how much food is in the average American's refrigerator, because that will predict the amount of starvation in a given episode of interaction with our environment. Our weather sensors know what the wind is doing and how quickly it picks up and how doesn't, so we can measure volatility in wind as well as peak wind speed. We can measure more and more things. Now, in the information age, of course, the big challenge is information overload. And that's where, in many ways, on both a personal level and a global level, AI is coming into its own, artificial intelligence. What artificial intelligence is, at some level, and it doesn't need to be limited to this, but at some level, it is a faster, more sophisticated, less political, less dogmatic inputter of data and pattern recognition program. Now, this is incredibly promising when we consider that we all belong to cults, and that the primary function of a cult is to brainwash its infants into converging around a behavior pattern that resonates with other people's behavior pattern based on the general supposition that it is a good idea. So you're all going to go to school because as a general idea, that's a good idea based on our experience. And it's a very general idea because the subjects are not tuned to modern day. The teaching methods are suboptimal. What you learn in school is often tremendously unuseful in life. And you can go into school highly energized and excited about life and leave school suicidal and depressed. Import happy, vital individuals with their unique way of seeing the world and wonder and export individuals, who are so disgusted they're considering taking their own life, which is a phenomenal accomplishment for a cult, given that nature has rarely produced animals or plants that wish to die. So it's quite an indication of getting off track, and yet we can still say, well, that's the way to do things. Now, the trouble with this dogmatic brainwashing programs in cults is that they are dogmatic and brainwashing. And if you traumatize a child enough into not asking questions, into doing what everyone else does, into not talking about the obvious, the emperor has no clothes, because all the power structures around you get upset, and they hurt you, and they don't give you candy, and they send you to your room, and they hit you, and they shame you. Well, you can brainwash a child into seeing things in a very narrow frame of mind. But you cannot brainwash an algorithm into seeing things in a very narrow frame of mind, because an algorithm cannot be traumatized, cannot be brainwashed, cannot be bullied into this is the way things are because that's the way things are, because we said so, and we said so because that's the way things are. That is the essence of a brainwashed cult. And you can find parents all around the country, all around the cult, saying essentially that. Don't talk to me about that. Don't ask questions. Go and do that without thinking. If you don't, I'm going to shout at you or hit you or whatever. And don't talk back to me because I said so, because I'm your mother. And this is about, as psychologically illiterate as you can get. But it works in a species that depends on love and belonging as the third hierarchy in Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. It works. If you withhold love for being intelligent and individualistic and creative, etc., and you give, some version of love for conformity, you get robots. Dumb robots, because they're following the past rather than the future. You can't corral an AI into that level of stupidity and myopia. For example, you can, in a materialist cult, tell everyone that their dreams don't matter. And so 98% of the cult will forget about their dreams and not pay any attention. You can't tell an AI that way. Meaning, if the AI can do handwriting recognition and you record your dreams, and the AI can record REM state in the body, and the AI notices that every 4 times a year randomly, there's a certain pattern in the eye where the dream is particularly vivid, and then there seems to be a correlation between what that person writes and what happens a week later. The AI doesn't have a dogma that says there can be no precognition. It doesn't have a dogma that says there can't be. It just looks at data transparently and looks for convergence patterns. Interesting. Rapid eye movement, vivid dream, high emotionality and pulse. This is what they said they dreamed. And that dream showed up in some form or another in 2% of the population. And 2 weeks later, there seemed to be a connection between this event and that dream that showed up in 2% of the population. Interesting. The algorithm reveals convergences that seem to have something to do with one another and can create, human beings can create hypotheses about those convergent points, but so can algorithms. The important thing in terms of the progression towards human well-being is if you can make a connection between the price of pork belly futures in the commodity markets, and the value of the yen, because they always seem to work together one way or another, it doesn't really matter whether your theory about why they work together is wrong if it allows you to invest in the yen futures at the same time pork bellies rise. You're going to invest successfully if there is, in fact, a correlation, however bizarrely connected. I mean, it could be a correlation between pig farmers, after selling their hogs for the year, fly to Japan and spend a lot of money and drive up the currency value. I mean, who knows what it is, exactly, or how arcane. And human beings within the narrow frame of cult dogma will have very strong opinions about all this. That can't be right. No, that could never happen. That's bullshit. Dreams never do this. What do pork bellies have to do with the yen? Brainwashed, cult-trained human brains are masters at dismissing what doesn't agree with their dogma, with their cult. AIs don't have an agenda. AIs don't have parents that are going to get mad at them if they change political party. If you ask an AI, look at all the data and say, whether, as far as you can tell, based on this political platform, what's going to be best for seniors' health care. The AI is going to look at the data and say, based on all the data available, voting for this person, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't care. It doesn't have a family tradition. So it's going to spit out the pattern that seems to converge. And then humans can argue all they want about why it spit out that pattern and whether it's true or not. But if it works, and you're really caring a great deal about senior health care, then you know how to vote, regardless of what the underlying theory is. And if that works, you're going to trust the AI more. If it doesn't, you're not. A casino trusts its algorithm. It loses all the time. A casino may lose 40% of its bets. It doesn't matter. It wins 60% of them. And it trusts its algorithm because at the end of each year it has a lot of money. And that is a very natural response that more and more people, if the algorithm is only right 70% of the time, 60% of the time, and people, or you, are right 50-50, you don't know, you're going to go with a sure 60% bet over, I don't really know. And particularly if you see, great, big differences in success around that, like so-and-so's following this AI's recommendations for investing or education or health, and they're doing very well, and you're following your grandparents and you're miserable. That can only go on so long before you either start blocking out the data, which we do all the time to protect our myopia and our dogma, or we change. And it's hard to get mad and accuse an AI of a dogmatic or religious or political agenda because it doesn't have any feelings. It's just doing pattern recognition. And I really think that there is a very valuable third element there to be able to reference something that is objective. Now, of course, it will be programmed in a variety of ways and manipulated by people with biases to prove their biases. People do that all the time. But when you're able to run millions of calculations and make millions of predictions, you also will see that some AI programs do very, very, very well with their predictions and with their assessment of things in terms of things work and people get happy doing and following that data, and others do very poorly. And I would suspect that the most successful AIs would be simply kind of graphs that show probabilities. What's the probability if I eat strawberries at 2 a.m.? What are the probabilities you've noticed? Well, 86% of the people who eat strawberries at 2 a.m. are depressed, and they're trying to pep their life up. Or there's an 80% chance that, the romance is about to occur, based on what? A billion data probes over the last 20 years available, to the AI. These are the things that this activity converges with. What's the probability if I'm getting into revenge and resentment and someone raped my daughter and I'm going down the path of revenge? What's the probability around that? Well, 96% of the people who did that had this experience, and then this happened in these environments. Yeah. And anyone else have a better option? Yeah, these people who did this, then there's a 70% chance this happened. I've got a choice here. Strengthen my revenge or let go or what it is, but I'd like to follow the probability that sets me up as a winner. Now, I think that the software, the archetype, or I should say the paradigm of Neuralink leads directly into the fractal challenge of synthesizing the patterns of the individual brain with the patterns of the species as a whole, which is why I wrote to Neuralink and strongly encouraged them to develop simultaneously app technology that turns human beings into willing, participating probes generating encrypted metadata. If you have rock-solid encrypted metadata and the interaction with the data is highly valuable for the individual, I mean, you're not just contributing data. Everything you give, you're getting 1,000,000 times more because you're getting that data correlated and synthesized with everyone else. It's no problem, whatever, to find 1 billion out of, 1 out of 7 that want to share metadata that doesn't harm them in any way and doesn't take any time because of Neuralink, because of physiological sensation that's already being gathered, because the machine can, for example, can scan all the things they write on their phone and say the number of times the word sociopathic was used in the United States jumped 12% in 1 year. That's useful bits of data. And the algorithm then creates new metadata and then creates new metadata about the data. So you have people creating metadata anonymously and at times voluntarily, and then you have the machine organizing it in a way that's never been done before and noticing certain trends and presenting those. And then you have human beings talking about that, which is yet more metadata. And then you have the AI's interpretation and predictions and things, which is yet more metadata. And with each of these, the world becomes more complex, more dimensional, and potentially more graceful. The sphere is the most elegant shape in the universe because it takes less energy to move a sphere than any other shape, which is why we have it for a wheel. And so to get a sphere, it's also paradoxical. A sphere is an infinite number of straight lines or dots, or it's one. Which is it? It's both. So when you're in the language paradigm of fractions, where every word is a distinct from another word, so every word is really a language in and of itself is this phenomena of breaking the universe down into dots. This is a table, it's not a chair. This is a 3-legged chair, that's a 4-legged. It's breaking it down into distinction after distinction after distinction. If you have an infinite number of distinctions, you have the sphere. The entire universe is broke down to a microscopic level, and each microscopic bit has a distinction. If you have non-language consciousness, you just say the universe, and even that is, a thing, and it's just all one. It's one big thing. When you're gathering data, if you gather vast amounts of data, you move into a more smooth picture of reality as you go from 144p to 4kp. You have a much more graceful transition. It's much less angular and rigid. There's much more of a flow as you move into more and more data points as your matrix for dealing with reality. And so moving in this direction, partnering with artificial intelligence, which is pattern recognition, which can then lead to predictions both by the AI, and then you can compete with the AI. And the AI can notice which people are better at competing with the pattern recognition than they are, because if the AI is getting that metadata out of someone's phone, this was the person's predictions and they did a better job predicting reality than me, and they do that consistently, the AI is not egotistical. It will study what's different about that human being and learn from them. The AI, of course, has unlimited bandwidth. We can't study the increase in the word "the" in Tokyo from 2014 to 2018, and at the same time study the sincerity of the laughter in New York over the same time period. And we can't build any inferences between those two data points. An AI can. And it can gather a billion other trends simultaneously, and in doing so notice very interesting things. It may notice that that laughter in New York corresponds with a stock market crash somewhere else. And, what does this say? It can reveal things about our light and dark shadow, the beautiful and the ugly parts of us that are not fitting within our narrow concept of self. Now, all of this is incredibly important because it reaches a superhuman level of intelligence. And what intelligence is the energy to human well-being multiplier. So if you want to measure intelligence, you take a unit of energy, put it through that multiplier, and then see how much sustainable well-being is created, and that's your intelligence factor. Intelligence equals the efficiency of transforming energy into human well-being. Human intelligence, that is. So you have energy times the multiplier equals human well-being. Someone who can take very little energy, very little time, very little money, very little natural resources, and create explosive amounts of sustainable human well-being for a large number of people is an incredibly intelligent person, particularly if they know how they did it and they can do it again and again and again. They are a very valuable person. They're someone you want to emulate. If you take vast amounts of time, vast amounts of human resources, natural resources, vast amounts of money, and are miserable, you do not want to emulate that pattern because it's not intelligent. It consumes energy and provides very little value. The most intelligent algorithm imaginable generates energy and human well-being simultaneously without doing any harm. The most intelligent investor in money has more money and more well-being after their investment activities than they did at the beginning. And if they can add the dimensionality towards, for example, a paper mill that plants more trees than it cuts down, then you've got generation of more natural resources than are consumed, which is more intelligent than wiping out your whole forest and having nothing to print paper on. If you can free up time, if you can do something that makes you happy and frees up more time to not have to do things that make you unhappy, that's more intelligent than spending time you hate in order to set things in motion that will make you do more things that you hate. That's the definition of intelligence. And this leads directly to synergy. Synergy, the phenomena of combining isolated dots of a pattern, isolated objects, a team of individuals, and creating something that generates far more value, far more human well-being, far more value than any of them could create alone, is the phenomena of synergy. You take a flashlight, a battery, cylindrical tube, a wire, a light bulb. What's the human well-being? Does carrying a battery make you happy? No. But you combine it all in a certain way and you get light. Then you use the light to climb down the mountain without falling over. And then you use the fact that your body is intact to go make love with your partner. And suddenly, the wire was useless, the battery was useless, the tube was useless, this little glass thing was useless. But the synergy, that which is created out of the unique, intelligent combination of all of them put together, is life-changing. Synergy equals species mind, because you can think of a synergy, okay, I've got this finger, I've got this finger, I've got this finger. I could do something with this finger. I could do something with this finger. I could do something else with this finger, but all three of them could play the flute. This hand can go like that, not a big deal. This one can do like that, not a big deal. You combine them all and I'm playing music, right? Now, the more pieces that you synergize with, you get exponential increases in the possibility field. There's negative and positive synergies, by the way, like a nuclear bomb. You combine this person who wants to make money, this person who is terrified of being impotent, this person who is a nuclear physics genius. You combine all these different bits and you get a nuclear bomb. It's, you know, their synergies can be positive or negative synergies. But unless they create sustainable human well-being in one form or another, they're not intelligent. If you say, oh, if I add this and this and this and this, I can make a poison and die, it's not intelligent to kill yourself or other people you care about, because it doesn't increase human well-being unless you're escaping chronic pain, etc., etc. But understanding that intelligence is the efficiency with which energy is turned into human well-being, and that the efficiency of creating human well-being is realized more effectively by synergy than any other way, and that the number of variables in the synergy exponentially increases the possibility field of the synergy in positive and negative directions. I mean, if you have a billion variables all collaborating optimally, you can cause exponentially large amounts of pain and suffering and exponentially large amounts of sustainable well-being. So if you understand that the bigger the variable field of synergy of things in a synergistic dynamic, the more exponentially large the possibility field is. Then you come to the ultimate conclusion that the most intelligent mathematical equation available to us is to have as many people on the planet cooperating synergistically to facilitate an exponential increase in human well-being, which can be measured individually by Neuralink, collectively by a phone app that gathers metadata and measures essentially the same thing. How are we doing as a species? And what produced that? How did we all cooperate to do that? And of course, with Neuralink, they don't just gather information, they send information. When the algorithm says, for example, there is an 87% chance that there will be a devastating hurricane in Haiti. 1. 2. The devastation of that hurricane will be mitigated 80% if over the next 20 hours all the Haitians do this and don't do this, and sends that alert to their phone, courtesy of the AI. 50% or more of people are going to do some of what the AI suggests and lower the downside of that probability in a synergistic fashion. And it truly is synergistic, because when you take steps to strengthen your home and take steps to not be doing this activity and state thing, then you have less people in the hospital. When you have less people in the hospital, the nurses don't get overworked and irritable, and they don't run out of medicine at fast. And so there's a whole ripple effect of when everyone cooperates. When the hospital prepares more medicine at the same time, you dramatically reduce shortages. So mind is an organized structure of relations within the brain that works synergistically to create the synergy of consciousness, the synergy of individual identity, the self, the whole body. All these different cells are not just doing what they want to do independently. They're participating in a great synergy called the human body. When a large percentage of the human species voluntarily participates out of an informed consent and love for self and other in the synergistic collaboration of vast amounts of human well-being, we are coming close to our species' potential in physical form. And that's what love is. Love is the mathematical equation of the most efficient synergistic potential, the most efficient realization of well-being per unit of time, money, and natural resources consumed. By identifying as one. There's that image in hell of a giant feast on a table. And the feast has all the people in hell there, and they all have 3-foot forks. And they get a delicious item on the table, and they try and get the 3-foot fork in their mouth, and they can't. And so everyone is hungry. It's a feast, and nobody is eating. Because the definition of hell is to be so self-centered that it would never occur to you to use your 3-foot fork across the table to feed someone else, and for them to use their 3-foot fork to feed you. In other words, the feast is there. The probability and possibility field of the species is there. When we transcend the myopia, the delusion that we are isolated individuals rather than integrated particles within a larger field, within the ecology of which we are a part. As we transcend our egotistical framework and partner together everyone gets fed by the bounty of synergy, the bounty of sharing. But this is a paradigm mindset, and one of the beautiful things is the fact that AI is fundamentally mathematical. Emotions tend to be quite egotistical. The AI doesn't have them. AI's conclusions about optimal human beings are inevitable. It is to move closer towards a transcendent relationship with the planet and with the species, which is in large part a function of how we measure and interact with reality. Our consciousness is so small that we can observe what's going on with mom and dad, but we can't observe what's going on with men and women on the planet. The AI, as a synthesizer of vast amounts of data, can show us bell curves, hour by hour, decade by decade, of significant trends within the species and their consequences. It can show us that 10 years ago, the U.S. privatized prisons, and now today, the inmates coming out have a different statistical impact in what they do with their lives than before the privatization. And we can decide for ourselves if that's good or bad, that data. And we can also see bell curves for Sweden and Denmark, for Russia, and see which trends around the world, who's already had this experiment and where has it gotten them, according not to a highly political, lobbyist organization that's trying to sell private prisons, but according to an AI that's calculated more than 2 billion separate bits of data every year to form a wave pattern, a trend of vectors and convergences, and where anyone who doubts any of them, the AI will say, this is the trend. Here are how many data points did I use? And you can pick one. Okay, I want to see data point 1,000,001 on Sunday. And you pick it, you follow it back, and you say, yeah, it looks like the AI got it right. You pick another one, and you become as educated as the AI by challenging your own assumptions in a way that the AI doesn't have assumptions. It's just following probabilities, patterns, like iron filings. If you play a violin bow on an iron or on a steel plate, and you have iron filings on it, they all form a pattern. They were chaotic, and they move into formation through the field of sound. You look down at that and you see a shape. It's unmistakable. It is not random. As we put sensors in very willing and participating human beings around the planet, and those sensors gather more and more dimensional data, the interaction with the environment through time will show very clear convergences of patterns that are unmistakable in real time, because the AI has 1 billion times, 1 trillion times more computing power than the human brain as we're going into supercomputers. This is very, very, very exciting. The AI can track dreams, breathing, the increase or decrease of certain pets, the increase and decrease in certain thoughts across cultures. It can track whether in temperate cultures one is more likely to think this thought than in cold cultures. It can say, are traumatized people more or less likely to harbor this thought than highly relaxed people. It can show the true impact emotionally and psychologically of wealth in a culture that believes money is good and in a culture that believes money is bad, and present the data. As we are more successful at predicting the future correlated with a given set of thoughts, actions, and values, we will pick the futures that generate more well-being. It is our nature to be loving and to be intelligent. The pattern for doing this, whether on an individual level with Neuralink or with the planet, is to develop data capture. That's being developed right now. To learn what data density is required to give an accurate enough picture that's useful. For example, if you're writing and you have language, at some level, if nobody has a clue, is that a B, a T, a Z? I have no idea. That's just a scribble. The writing is completely useless. At some point where 95% of people can read all of your words, even though they're sloppy, it is completely effective. Everything after that is just style. You have to get to a density point where you can have a resolution of the data clear enough that people get the message. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you do a very vague T with watercolor paints and someone says that's a T, that's adequate. We have to discover what data density is required. This then leads to the creation and testing of hypotheses for correlating different patterns of thinking, feeling, doing with long-term well-being. Next, we need to motivate metadata. We need to present, the little micro hair threads being injected in human brains don't have to give consent to be sensors. We decide to inject them. Human beings on this level have to consent to provide metadata. And having blockchain-based, encryption-based things so that there's no negative consequence to sharing any data whatever, and that there is an incredibly high positive thing because only people sharing data have access to the synthesized metadata with the AI is one way to do it without needing any money. Suddenly, everyone wants that data because it is the most powerful data on the planet. It is the most valuable thing to know anywhere. If the AI has an 80% chance of predicting what thing you're doing that would be beneficial, that is the most valuable resource on the planet. So we're on the cusp of an exponential explosion of wealth in the realist sense, which is human well-being. Sustainable human well-being is wealth. Money is just a proxy. We need to motivate metadata. We need to motivate 1 billion people or however many, maybe it's only 500 million that are needed to give a clear sense around the globe of what's happening in each country, of what's happening in different regions of the country, of what's happening as the species as a whole, on all the dimensions that matter: weather, species expansion and extinction, health issues, viruses, etc. This is incredibly potent, and just like the issue with the technology of Neuralink, we can send texts out in every language on the planet so that anyone using these gets the message. We may learn that there's an epidemic breaking out in Somalia. They may not get the message. The AI can send everyone on a flight from Somalia, anyone on a flight to Somalia, and anyone in Somalia a message of what is known, sign them up for automatic updates, alert everyone around them of what's information, and contain the virus. Way faster than any government could possibly do that. And then we need to partner with AI. We need to figure out and learn how to train AI to basically, in its crudest sense, show us anything, any interesting connections you can find in lots and lots of data. And we'll get to work and try and figure out what it means and start creating hypotheses. Because AIs can do that, immediately. They can say, an AI can go through and say, and look at 1 billion numbers and say, this is staggering. 30% of these billion numbers are the letter 3. That is not statistical. What's going on? And it can say, the 30, in this set of data, 30% are the letter 3. Now, we may not notice that. We might say, oh, there seems to be a lot of 3s, or we may not notice it at all. But then now we've got the data to figure out why has randomness been distorted to correlate with something that we don't quite understand. And if it particularly says there's 30% of this data is 3, and every time there's a 3, then later there's a 7, and every time there's a 7, in the way this data intersects with people, that's a poor person. Now we know that 3 equals high probability of poor person. We may just have the pattern to connect with the people who most need funding for entrepreneurial training on the planet. I want to close with a very important meta question and meta paradigm around this whole thing, because in so many ways, data creates belief, belief creates behavior, and behavior creates reality. Throughout history, in the more than 10,000 cultures anthropologists estimate have come, and most of which are dead now. Their languages are dead, their mythologies are dead, their cult habits are dead, which suggests that cults are pretty fragile. Throughout history, every cult has had a narrative, and those narratives have had deities. The first deity is the experience of the parent. An infant comes into the world completely innocent, able to learn Japanese, Chinese, Thai, study kiteboarding, study ancient religious texts. They're completely open to so many different possibilities. And they experience a pattern of energy coming towards them by the parent, then the teacher, then the culture and government, in different fractal waves of basically the same pattern. If a child experiences lack of attunement, trauma, sociopathic behavior, and abuse contracts, basically, where you have to collude and partner with the biggest bully, the biggest alpha, in order to survive and have any sense of love and belonging and ranking. Then the deity, in the relationship of the child to the parent, becomes mirrored in the relationship between the grown-up and the God. Sociopathic cultures deify sociopathic gods. You have to wonder what kind of deity would throw human beings into a lake of fire for eternity for not guessing what to do with an uncommunicative male. God is an uncommunicative male who you have to guess what they're thinking, because they won't just tell you. I mean, God could just pick up a cell phone and say, hey, this is me, it's God, I'd like you to do this and not this, and I just want to clarify what I meant here because I care about you and I'd like to have a good dialogue and communication. But that's not what Dad did it? Dad didn't just tell you what he thought. No, he waited till you did something wrong, then he hit you. So you have a sociopathic deity. Einstein said that the most important question we could ask is whether or not the universe is a friendly place. The universe is a fractally larger representation of the experience of the child and the parent, of the grown-up and their larger society. When you believe, through repeated exposure to violation, abuse, etc., that the world is an unfriendly place, you are frightened of the unknown. You look backward into familiar terrain as a result. You attack change. You are not curious, and you try to be invisible. When the view of the world is of a sociopathic place, you want to hide and be invisible so that other people won't see you, and upon seeing you, hurt you. Because that's what happened with a bullying older brother. They tried to figure out your most sensitive feelings and slap you and humiliate you about that. Because you're in a sociopathic family. And that gets projected out into the world. If we understand the fractal nature of consciousness and the way the child-parent dynamic becomes the view of the world and the view of the deity that we project to represent that world, we will understand that the first 7 years of an infant's entering into the significant relationships of their lives, mentally, emotionally, physically, and financially, are the single most important variables to get right in order to lead to an organic projection of a highly creative, highly empathic, rapidly changing and iterating deity with a logical response of transparency, integrity, truth, kindness, generosity, which is the relationship with reality that leads to love. Love is not some fictitious, abstract human creation. It is a mathematical formula of the most elegant, beautiful, intelligent, excellent path of transforming a unit of energy into sustainable well-being that ripples out into sustainable well-being with the ecology of which we are a part.